Do other people see the screen that she's sharing? Okay.
Okay, Allison or Jean.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. The League of Women Voters of Illinois is happy to welcome you to Issues Briefing 2022. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. At the core of the mission goals of the League of Women Voters of Illinois is civic engagement and education. Our annual Issues Briefing is a point in time where we gather to seek information and understanding, to educate ourselves and each other, and use information as the basis for generating civic engagement and advocacy for change. Issues Briefing is also the beginning of an opportunity. It's the moment we can take what we learn into our communities, where we listen to understand, we collaborate, we educate, and we activate others. What we know about civic engagement and education is this: people who have information, people who are engaged, those people are more likely to be voters. We each have a voice through our vote and our right to vote. And that voice, our vote, each of our votes must be heard. Ultimately, that is where our strength lies. So we must work to ensure that we each use our voice, that everyone who is eligible to vote uses that voice, uses their vote. So let's educate and let's activate. Let's see more people using their voice to speak up about what matters the most to them. Tonight, as we focus on education and the freedom to explore, to learn, to share, to express, and to teach, I urge you to listen actively, ask questions, and take what you learn into your community, to your family, your friends, your neighbor, to the places where you live. Before we begin, I remind you that our meeting tonight is being recorded. Subtitles have been enabled this evening. If you would like to activate, enlarge, or end the subtitles, go to the bar at the bottom of your screen. Toward the end of the session, we will have a question and answer period. During the session, please put your questions directly into the chat and do that as a direct message to Question Asker. League members will pose the questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming our American Sign Language interpreters for the evening, Sheila Kettering and Vera Marie Baldosa. Thank you to our League of Women Voters of Illinois Board of Directors, to the League of Women Voters of Illinois Issues and Advocacy Committee and co-chairs, and to everyone who has been a part of helping bring together this fantastic entire week of education and activation. So now, turn off those phones, lean in and engage. Ann Corder, our issue specialist for education, will introduce our speakers. Ann.
Thank you, Allison. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 LWVIL Issues Briefing. This evening's program is addressing culturally relevant instruction. Our first speaker, James Tager, is from PEN America, a nonpartisan organization defending freedom of expression. He will share research about legislation being proposed around the country to limit free discussion in classrooms about diversity. James?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. For me, it's a distinct privilege because I was born in Chicago, because my family has roots in Illinois. To this day, almost all of my mother's side lives either in Chicago or in the Collar counties, where my family moved to Illinois around the 1950s from the faraway land of northern Indiana. That's my big opening joke, by the way, that northern Indiana. Like that, it's really going to get downhill from here. I hope you liked it. I work with PEN America. We are a free expression and literary advocacy organization. We focus on celebrating and defending the written word and freedom of expression in all its forms. I'm basically here today because of a report that I had the privilege of being one of the authors on that we at PEN America put out in November of last year. And I am dropping the link in now. If you want to look at the report after this, I'd be happy to have your eyeballs. But it's a report that has to do with what we call educational gag orders. And what happened was in 2021, I'm going to pull up the, where did it go? Okay, I am screen sharing. Yes, nailed it. In 2021, we started noticing something that was really of serious concern to us, which was a wave of legislation proposed at the state level in state after state, attempting to block or ban specific ideas or concepts or teachings of American history, civics, and literature. Those who supported these bans called them anti-critical race theory bills, despite the fact that these bills really didn't seem to target critical race theory in and of itself. Critical race theory is an academic doctrine that's largely taught at the grade school level. But what we saw was a list of prohibited ideas or viewpoints or concepts that state legislators across the country were trying to excise out of the classroom and out of other areas, but we're really going to focus on the classroom in this conversation. And so a colleague of mine and I and another legal consultant we worked on investigating what was going on and analyzing these bills from social and legal perspectives. My background is in law, and we tried to figure out what to call these bills that we were seeing, because they weren't anti-critical race theory bills, because many of the bills tried to block things that were much broader than anti-critical race theory. And we tried to figure out what's the terminology that would best capture what these bills were trying to do. And we ended up calling them educational gag orders, right? They are bills designed to chill academic and educational discussions and impose government dictates, ideological dictates on teaching and learning. And I'm going to use this time today to sort of walk you through what we saw and what we concluded in some of our thoughts on these educational gag orders, two of which are within the are before the Illinois legislature today, by the way. Illinois House Bill 5494 and Illinois House Bill 5505. So as I mentioned, we saw these educational gag orders as a part of a deliberate effort to use, quote, critical race theory, unquote, as a catch-all term for controversial or unpopular educational practices related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom. And they basically follow from three distinct areas of inspiration. The most significant one is President Trump's Executive Order 13950 on combating race and sex stereotyping. There are other inspirations. One was the Saving American History Act from Senator Tom Cotton, and also the Partisanship Out of Civics Act from academic Stanley Kurtz. And those bills were, and they are, being supported by a set of conservative sort of think tanks that have acted as a useful intermediary to spread these bills from state to state. And some of you may recall, we really saw this as an issue that surged to the fore in Virginia in the governor's race, where the governor basically campaigned on this idea of sort of preventing dangerous ideas from infiltrating our schools. And so this is an idea with a lot of political currency. And unfortunately, the Virginia's governor's race has helped catalyze an even greater explosion of these bills across the country, as legislators have seen that they can make political hay out of this issue, regardless of the effect that it might have on students and teachers. Now, I want to make it clear. Educational gag orders are really a threat to the US education system and to some of the freedoms we cherish and hold dear. These bills that seek to basically excise or block certain viewpoints or ideas, or even in factual presentations of history, are illiberal in their attempt to legislate that certain ideas are out of bounds. They're dismissive of academic freedom, of liberal education, and the values of free speech and open inquiry that are enshrined in our First Amendment and that anchor us as a democratic society. Their exercises in state power to exert ideological control over educational institutions. They're disproportionately likely to affect the speech of students, educators, and trainers who are women, who are people of color, and who are LGBTQ+. They're certain to be applied broadly and arbitrarily. Basically, these bills will be applied in ways that reflect the political and ideological biases of the people who enacted them. They're de facto bans on wide swaths of literature, curriculum, historical materials, and other media. They threaten to chill how educators do their jobs. They are focusing on silencing content and narratives, particularly dealing with or about or by people of color. And as I mentioned, they pose a risk to the way we educate our children, and they threaten to silence vital societal discourses on racism and sexism. So in the fall of 2020, we can really trace the origins of the educational gag orders back to a specific event. And those of you who watched the recent John Oliver segment on this, by the way, will know what I'm talking about, where there was a specific conservative activist named Chris Rufo who went on Fox News and said, critical race theory is dangerous. President Trump, I call on you to issue an executive order combating critical race theory. And the president went out and did it, right? So this is an example of governance by Fox News, governance by talk show, which should already give you an inkling of why it's so dangerous, right? And President Trump offered this set of definitions of the types of concepts. This is important, the types of concepts that he wanted excised from government trainings. Now, from this executive order, it jumped very quickly from government trainings to trying to block these areas out of the classroom. But let's take a look at these concepts, right? You can't teach that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. You can't teach that an individual, by virtue of their race or sex, is inherently racist or sexist, that an individual should be discriminated against partially because of their race or sex, that members of a race or sex cannot or should not attempt to treat others without race or sex, without respect to race or sex. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of race or sex. That any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex, or that meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist. Now, you may read any one of these and agree or disagree with them, right? But let me tell you something. I'm a Harvard-educated lawyer. I have no idea how you could actually implement these bans in the classroom, right? For example, how do you teach about slavery in this country, about the civil rights movement in this country, about the treatment of Native Americans, about women's suffrage in this country, as just a few major examples? How do you teach that in a way that doesn't bring up the specter that someone feels discomfort in regard to their race or sex, right? All of these are very broad. They will be arbitrarily interpreted by those who are charged with enforcing them. And they basically put teachers on notice that certain areas of teaching are to be treated with kid gloves. That when you talk about slavery, when you talk about civil rights, when you talk about historical events that have happened in our country, that you have to treat them with a special set of sensitivity to basically make sure that you don't trouble kids or really trouble their parents in the classroom. Because kids will come home every day and say, hey, here's what I learned in class. And it's the parents who will say, my goodness, my kid just learned how to feel discomfort over the fact that he's white, because when we talked about slavery, the teacher taught, well, this was white people enslaving black people. This is against the law. I want that teacher to be fired, right? These are, the concepts that have been worked into these educational gag orders in state after state after state. If you read this and you feel you have a very clear idea how these bills could be implemented in practice, I want to hear from you, because again, the teachers I've spoken with do not have a clear idea of how to implement this in practice. They do, however, people have a clear idea of what the message is sent, what message is sent by the politicians who are proposing this, which is to teach a sanitized and whitewashed both literally and figuratively, vision of American history, literature, and culture. How do you teach a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, which has to do with, thorny and painful issues of race in America's history, without potentially running afoul of these divisive concepts, which is to say, without potentially running afoul of the law, if and where these bills are passed? There are, I think, there are others, a couple other areas that have been implemented, that Trump implemented in his executive order and that we've seen proposed in state after state. And by the way, I'll go back to this. I looked at Illinois House Bill 5494. House Bill 5494's list looks a lot like this list that I'm showing you right now. Illinois House Bill 5505 has a shorter and more concise list, but both of these bills clearly are inspired by the Trump executive order and by the educational gag order bills that have proliferated because of it. Going back to another set here, race or sex stereotyping says ascribing traits or values to an individual because of his or her sex. Race or sex stereotyping means assigning fault, blame, or bias to a race or sex, or to members of race or sex because of their race or sex. It similarly encompasses any claim that consciously or unconsciously members of a race are inherently racist or inherently inclined to impress others. This is to say that it would be illegal to even discuss the concept of systemic racism or systemic sexism in class. To bring in the work of thoughtful scholars who have made this argument that the United States has not, been able to move past historical artifacts of racism and sexism in our past because of structural issues, not because of any individual bias, but because of structural issues in the way that the United States, comports itself. Basically, these bills would block, at the very least, a large portion, arguably all, of contemporary efforts to introduce culturally responsive teaching or diversity, equity, inclusion in the classroom, right? This is an attempt to say you cannot teach race and racism in a way that makes us uncomfortable. We have now made it illegal, right? It is an attempt to resolve the debate, the conversation we are having socially, societally, about race and racism or in classrooms and workplaces across the United States, in conversations between well-meaning people, that these bills basically try to block that by legislative fiat, right? How to teach race and racism, sex and sexism, how to teach these thorny issues in American classrooms is difficult. And well-meaning people of different perspectives can have reasonable disagreements over how to most responsibly do that. These bills are not that. These bills are an attempt to basically block other viewpoints from the classroom that the proponents of these bills disagree with. It is, in my personal, humble, but expert opinion, fundamentally un-American. I think it's one of the most significant ironies of the fact that we see these bills proliferate in state after state, which is to say that the proponents of these bills say they're trying to block un-American ideologies. But to me, there's nothing more un-American than trying to excise viewpoints, ideas, and even facts that you disagree with from the classroom. So when we put our report out in November 2021, we looked at bills from January to September 21. 2021. We saw 54 state level bills in 24 states, as well as 10 federal bills. And of course, I think we've all seen this is also playing out in communities. School board after school board have been embroiled with debates over critical race theory, a theory that I would say 2 years ago, the average American did not even know about, but suddenly it's on everyone's lips. A few points about this, we have seen bills that apply to teaching in public schools. We have seen bills that apply to teaching in public colleges and universities, including bills, again, this is from January to September to 21. So these are not the most updated figures, but bills that include restrictions on college level teachings, bills that identify specific materials that they want to block, and bills that try to prohibit schools, teachers, or instructors for, quote, compelling a student to affirm a belief in a divisive concept. If I recall correctly, House Bill 5505 takes this formulation. They say, oh, no, we're just trying to block people from compelling a student to believe certain things. We're not saying that we would excise these viewpoints from the classroom. We're saying that we're blocking students from being compelled to believe certain things. As we explain in the report, this argument is really facetious, right? You're still identifying a specific viewpoint or argument that you are saying, hey, we want the state to treat this viewpoint with suspicion, not any other viewpoint. We have singled out this viewpoint or concept or idea and are saying the state, the government, should treat this one specific viewpoint with suspicion. Furthermore, it's completely unnecessary. There is no legal utility to passing a bill that stops teachers from compelling a student to affirm a belief in a certain concept. You know why? Because the First Amendment already does that. People can't be compelled to believe a certain viewpoint. So these bills are at the very least completely unnecessary. And at worst, they're again singling out a specific idea and saying the state will look at this with disfavor. Certain bills mandate the, quote, balanced teaching of controversial, quote, controversial political or social topics, or the equal presentation of diverse and contending views. I believe House Bill 5505 is a bill that does something like this. And I'll talk more about how we've seen this implemented on the ground in ways that are deeply, deeply troubling. So as I said before, from January, September 2021, we saw 54 state level bills in 24 states. We saw in November how this was an issue that was used to remarkable effect in the Virginia governor's race. And everyone from them seemed to receive the message that these bills are great political red meat. So more recent figures are really shocking. From January 2021 to up to today, if we update those figures, we're looking at 171 state level bills in 40 states, as well as executive orders or state policies, right? 125 of these bills are currently in active consideration from state legislators. And as mentioned, that includes Illinois House Bill 5494 and Illinois House Bill 5505. 12 laws have passed in 10 states. That's a low passage rate, but these bills are becoming law. These bills are not something we can sleep on. These bills are becoming law, and they are affecting what our teachers will teach our children by excising certain viewpoints, ideas, or even the presentation of facts. Here are our 4 main observations about these bills. Each of these bills represents an effort to impose content and viewpoint-based censorship. These bills literally identify specific viewpoints they want to ban from the classroom. But what do I mean when I say content-based censorship? What I mean is these bills may be used to ban the factual teaching of history to our children. How can you teach about the Trail of Tears? How can you get into the worst atrocities of slavery or the civil rights movement without raising the possibility that someone will come for your job or for your school's budget, or someone will complain to an elected official and say they're violating a state law saying, gee, these viewpoints are not allowed, right? How do you distinguish between facts that imply a viewpoint and the viewpoint itself? Okay. when you teach slavery to a set of students, some students may say, may think to themselves, oh, okay, this was a system imposed by white people on black people, right? There is no easy distinction between the facts that may lead a student to conclude something and the viewpoint itself. So in blocking these viewpoints, the way that teachers will respond, and we are seeing this already on the ground, I will give a couple examples, is, oh boy, I do not want to run afoul of this new law because I don't want to lose my job, or I don't want to teach students, I don't want parents to call up the principal and say, I'm breaking the law, or I don't want my school to lose funding, right? Which, by the way, these are all options under some of the bills. Many of the bills do not have specific penalties, which means that likely they will be used in budgetary processes instead. If a bill doesn't have a specific penalty, that doesn't mean there's no penalty. It just means that legislators can turn to it later as an excuse to cut school funding. But teachers will say to themselves, my goodness, I do not want to be accused of teaching people that white kids should feel bad for being white, or that male children should feel bad for being male. So I will pull back from certain lessons I offer on women's suffrage. I will pull back from certain lessons I offer about slavery, right? I will dumb down and sanitize what I teach my kids so that I don't get accused of breaking the law. If you're a parent watching this, I hope you take this personally. I hope you take this personally, because this is an attempt to inject ideological considerations and politics into your children's education. Individually and collectively, these bills will have a foreseeable chilling effect. I think I discussed that, right? Teachers will not know how to do this. Teachers will not know how to block a viewpoint from their teaching. What they will know is what legislators have said about it. And legislators have been very clear in talking about these radical ideologies and the social justice ideas and critical race theory as a way of sending a message about how certain ideas around systemic racism will be seen as violating these laws, these bills and these laws, even if that's not spelled out in the laws themselves. Even when crafted in ways that nominally permit free expression, these bills, and when they're implemented, these laws send an unmistakable signal that specific ideas, arguments, theories, and opinions will not be tolerated by the government. These bills are based on misrepresentation of how intellectual frameworks is taught. As mentioned, critical race theory is a graduate level idea. You have some proponents of these bills saying, well, we acknowledge that critical race theory is not being taught in grade schools, but the teachers learn it in grad school and then they bring it into the grade school. But it just further raises the question. I mean, again, how do you block an idea? I mean, if the idea is, okay, well, it's not being taught, but the people who taught it might have been taught it. I mean, it's a bit of a hat on a hat, right? It's a bit, my goodness, okay, are you trying to block viewpoints that the teacher might have learned alongside other viewpoints that the teacher might have learned? And you're saying that's what you're worried about. I mean, how do you draw a line to block specific ideas from the classroom? You can't do it in a way that doesn't block, broad swaths of content and conversation, right? I mean, remember, a lot of this will manifest itself in how teachers feel they can communicate with students, right? If a student says, oh, I think that this shows systemic racism, and the teacher says, good point. Does that mean the teacher has violated the law now? Do they have to basically stop themselves from encouraging students to think for themselves and from voicing their opinions in the classroom because they're afraid that they will break the law? These bills also sometimes are misrepresentation of specific facts. We've seen a bill that said that, okay, you must teach that the founding of the country was July 4th, 1775. I hope you all understand that the founding of the United States of America was not July 4th, 1775. It was surely a mistake, but it demonstrates how quickly and how, frankly, poorly these bills are being drafted. There was another situation, I think it was in Tennessee, it's in my report, don't quote me, I think it was in Tennessee, where one state legislator who supported the bill spoke in defense of the bill. What happened was one Black legislator said, my goodness, if we implement this bill, how are we going to teach the 3/5 compromise, by which slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person? And the legislator who supported the bill stood up and said, well, actually, that's an example. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The 3/5 compromise was a great attempt to limit the effect of slavery, where the great majority of historical consensus is it was the exact opposite, that the 3/5 compromise actually solidified the effect of slavery by giving slaveholding states more power, right? So this is another example of how even basic facts about our history could be misrepresented by these bills. If even the legislators proposing these bills are mistaken on basic issues of history. We saw another example recently where someone said, you know, we want to teach the Lincoln Douglas debates, which were between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. No, they weren't. They were between Senator Douglas and Senator Lincoln, right? People get things wrong all the time. Unfortunately, in this situation, some of the people getting it wrong are trying to legislate what teachers should teach and should not teach in the classroom. Many of these bills include language that purport to uphold free speech and academic inquiry. I gave you one example earlier of the bills that say, oh, no, we're just trying to stop teachers from compelling students to believe certain things. That language is probably intended to help safeguard these bills from constitutional challenges, but it does little to nothing to change the essential nature of these bills as instruments of censorship. Let me get into an example and give you some of the grounding. So this was the bill that was passed in June in Texas, House Bill 3979. This is law. This is now law. It is one of the educational gag orders we talked about. One of the provisions is how it says a teacher who chooses to discuss a controversial issue of public policy shall strive to explore the topics from diverse or contending perspectives without giving deference to one perspective. I think House Bill 5505 in Illinois has something similar. Don't quote me. I looked at it today and I'm reasonably sure, but I'm not 100% certain. But again, this was House Bill 3979 in Texas, middle of the road educational gag order, has all the greatest hits. Okay. This actually happened at a training session for educators in South Lakes, Texas's Carroll School District. The district's executive director of curriculum instruction was calling the teachers and saying, hey, here's what you need to do to make sure you don't violate the law. And she said, just remember the concepts of House Bill 3979. And she said to educators, when you teach about the Holocaust, teach different perspectives. And a teacher said to her, wait, how do you teach opposing views about the Holocaust? And she said, trust me, that's come up. This is what we're talking about if we whitewash, sanitize, dumb down, and force ideological constraints on our teachers. Things like this, the ideological distortion of factual events which occurred in order to meet the requirements of the law, and teachers and their superiors being afraid of violating the law and thus telling each other, hey, make sure to bow to the ideological views that have been imposed on you by state legislators in order to make sure that you don't lose our job or that we don't lose our funding. Here's another thing that happened in the aftermath of that House bill. I had the privilege of being one of the first commentators on this and being one of the first people to see this, which was a principal of a charter school in Texas that sought to serve predominantly the Black and Hispanic community, applied for approval from the Texas Education Agency. And they were going through the process, things were going well until the Texas Education Agency wrote them and said, hey, in your application and on your website, we want you to scrub all mentions of books or authors that contravene 3979. And I was one of the first people to sit down with the journalists and figure out what that meant. And we went to the exact page that the Texas Education Agency had identified in the school application. And it mentioned only one author, and that was author Ibram X. Kendi, who and his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I believe the quote that they had was the true opposite of being a racist is not being non-racist, it's being anti-racist. And the Texas Education Agency said, you cannot cite to that author or book during the application process. Now, Essence Prep is a charter school, but as I explained when the story broke, there's no school that's going to read this and say, oh, okay, I guess that's okay for us to teach. It highlights something that is tremendously important that I hope each and every one of you listening walks away with. Each and every one of these education gag order bills, and that includes, in my expert opinion, the two bills that are being considered in Illinois right now, House Bill 5494 and House Bill 5505, are book banning bills. As they are implemented, they will be used to ban books from the classroom, possibly from the library, from the school library. Okay. We are at a time, and I've been doing book banning work for almost 6 years now. And I've fought book bans on the left and on the right. I've gone across the country and spoken about book bans. I've fought book bans in schools, libraries, and prisons. We are at a time when we are seeing book bans on the rise. I've been in the room with maybe a dozen expert anti-book ban advocates. And we've just gone around the room telling each other that we're blown away by how much book bans are on the rise, how books are being challenged in school boards and communities across the country. The American Library Association has said they've received unprecedented levels of book challenges. And it's not just the frequency, but it's the tactics. And a lot of this comes from the hysteria around critical race theory. And we are seeing books that are being challenged to an extent not previously seen. And we're seeing a new frequency of an old truism, something I can attest to as someone who has worked on book banning for years, which is that books that are written by or featuring authors who are of color or LGBTQ+ or disabled are disproportionately likely to be banned.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the passion and the expertise that you shared with us. And hopefully we'll have time later on to hear more, but we do need to give time to the senator to present her perception of what is happening in Illinois.
Yeah, so Senator Pacione-Zayas, our very own Illinois state senator, can talk now about what's actually happening close to home. Senator?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Just can I get a thumbs up? Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna walk us through some of this as quickly as I can, give some context and background. I think, our previous presenter has given us a lot to kind of wrap our heads around and really a good starting point. But I usually kind of start off all of my work through, let me make sure I'm sharing my screen here, through talking about my own background and how I kind of got involved in education, because it's going to tie back to this whole culturally responsive teaching and leading standards that are happening here in Illinois. And I'll talk a little bit about those other two bills that were mentioned, because I do think it's important that we lift those up. Okay, so I always like to start a little bit about my background, because I grew up in Logan Square on the northwest side of Chicago. My parents met at the Logan Square Boys and Girls Club as after-school instructors. And I basically spent my very early years and into my early primary grade years essentially growing up in the club and understanding that the that community is family. And so in many ways, I watched my parents work around the clock to negotiate gang truces, to ensure that families had their basic needs met, but most importantly, that children and young people were seen, heard, and validated. I just want to make sure I'm seeing my screen glitch a little bit. Is that glitching for you all?
No.
Okay, I can work past it. I'm going to use some executive functioning here. Anyway, I bring that up because, you know, I think it's really important because, like I said, growing up in that context and really growing up in movement work, because my parents used the Boys and Girls Club as a space to organize our community, to fight back against gentrification, to ensure that families' needs were met and that we had affordable housing and that we're also ensuring that we had high quality schools. All of that informed the context in which I grew up. And that kind of then brings me to this next point that we always talk about in education, and particularly in early childhood. Yuri Bronfenbrenner talks about this ecological systems theory, right? So what you see in the middle of that screen is the baby that then becomes the child, that then becomes the young adult. But what's really important for us to consider when we're thinking about them is that they're not just widgets, right? They're growing up in the context of relationships and a ecology of systems, or an ecosystem that interacts with each other. And that's why it's incredibly important that we don't consider children or young people as independent of the environment that they come in. Yes, or the environment that they come from and what they're now going to be bringing to the school. And so that's one of the kind of considerations when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching and learning, that we're considering these kinds of influences, everything from the very close relationships, such as the peers, the family, the culture, to then widening out to the neighborhood, the community, the city, the national and global context, that is all influencing how this young person is making sense of the world, making sense of relationships, and navigating spaces. And as we all know, this little virus here has totally turned us topsy-turvy and has revealed things in many ways that we can no longer deny exist, right? For many, with the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of folks, kind of saw it as an opportunity to finally, for most folks to come up to speed with a lot of the disparities that were not only just happening in schools, but were happening in communities, right? Because we just had a very disproportionate impact in terms of how that has affected various communities across the country and across the globe, to be honest. And so, but one thing that I think is really important as it relates to schools is that immediately the pandemic made it so apparent that you could, no longer unsee what you saw. Schools became resource hubs. Schools became distribution centers. Schools became a space where families were relying on getting food and getting referrals for social service agencies while we had this massive disruption of in-person learning, right? And so what that tells you is that we, in many ways, a lot of young children are coming to schools depending on food, depending on social services, and then of course getting a core education. That is the ideal, so to speak. But we had a lot of schools that were struggling to try to meet those demands in this context, right? Now you layer on what we then witnessed in the brutal murder of George Floyd and the aftermath of it in terms of the outrage and the rejection of how people were processing white supremacy and its manifestations in all of our systems. And now, as young children and young people were witnessing this, participating this, leading this mobilization, we now have a space in place where we can no longer deny some of the things that were presented in the past presentation, because in so many ways, people thought of the civil rights movement as so far away and all the inequities that came out of that. Oh, that was previous generations. Well, we saw right front and center on all of our screens what was happening, plain and simple, not only with that single act, but then the many manifestations and mobilizations that came after that started to lay out the litany of policy and practice that has embedded white supremacy in its manifestations within our systems. So I was at the time serving on the State Board of Education, and this is going to get me to the point around the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. And what was super interesting while I was on the board, you know, I had at this point been on the board, I want to say, yep, it was about like a year and a half. My background is in educational policy. I've worked in schools. I've worked in community-based organizations. I'm obviously, you know, with the origin story, I'm a part of social movements and community organizing. So I bring those lenses to the work. And I was sitting at that table. I also have 2 children in Chicago public schools. And I also worked in Chicago public schools. So definitely, you know, have various kind of experiences within our schools. And what was super interesting is that the system responded in a very typical way that institutions do. And it was like, oh, let's make a proclamation. We're going to, you know, we're going to just stand and say, we are going to eliminate racial injustice, so on and so forth. Well, I was not really satisfied with that, because from day one, as soon as I sat at that table, I said, what are we going to be intentional and deliberate about to really change the trajectory of education? I am a student of Paulo Freire, and Paulo Freire talks about education is an act of liberation and freedom. And what I constantly see happening in our schools is we kind of revert back to these old school methodologies. And then we talk about all these equity gaps, and we use these standardized assessments, which are point in time tools that have a lot of problems with bias and have a lot of problems with spending a lot of money to tell us things we already kind of know. And so I really stood up at that point and I said, look, you know, I'm not for this little proclamation if we're not going to be doing the real work. And when I came to the table from day one, I said, what we have to do in every single decision we make is apply a racial equity impact analysis tool, so that we can ensure that the decisions that we're making, intentionally or not intentionally, are not going to reproduce the same outcomes that are racialized disparities. And so I kept on pushing, and they said, oh, let's wait. And then here you have this situation with George Floyd, and we think that we just can put up a little, you know, statement and think that was fine. Well, I did cause a stir that day. Myself and the vice chair, you know, really spoke out against this. And, you know, we also refrained from voting on things because we were just done with the performance of the work. Well, some people would say, oh, you're just being a disruptor. It actually did result in some things. And those things are kind of laid out here. And so the State Board of Education then started to really kind of like roll up its sleeves and get big about, or get more deliberate about its equity path. And so what you see here is what they kind of did in the past. There would be goals about equity in the strategic plan. There was the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the federal legislation that is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that provides for public education, that has all these protections around specific populations and classes and distributes money as such. But we also had this evidence-based funding formula, which is getting at our whole, you know, funding piece and the inequities around communities that have lower property value, and how that creates a huge gap in our education funding versus what the state actually kicks in. To now, in the present, there were obviously more refined equity values and beliefs, but then there was this advisory group that was going to specifically be looking at certain tools that we can use both internally as an individual, as a collective, and externally. And what that then turned into was not just a working group, but now to have for school districts what they call an equity journey, kind of report card, so to speak. This is being piloted, and it's going to actually be rolled out in school year 2023. Not punitive, not necessarily in the space of trying to tell schools what they're doing wrong, but to identify where are their strengths in this equity journey? What does it look like beyond just the celebratory things of let's diversify, you know, let's have a Black History Month assembly, right? Let's actually go a lot deeper in that, and let's reflect and see how that can get embedded in our curriculum in ways that we were just talking about in the previous presentation that are trying to be banned. But I want to just, and even though the previous presentation talked a lot about kind of the more aggressive forms of how racial equity or critical race theory or culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, unfortunately, those three things often get interchanged and they mean very distinct things. But there's very aggressive opposition, but I want to point out to you all, because this is present in so many different ways within our school system, what I call these racial equity detours. And I came across this work as I was working in the early childhood space, because it presents in a way that can be very covert, but also can be damaging in our school systems. And so just to kind of highlight a few, the first one being pacing for privilege, right? Where, we have to wait for the right time to, go deep into this work. It's going to harm the children, specifically the white children who, what they were referencing back in Florida when they said, oh, this is going to be too much for white children to take on, right? There's also the celebrating diversity detour that happens a lot in schools, right? Let's have, a book fair focused on Native American storytelling. And, it kind of becomes a performance versus actually getting into the in-depth content and the history that is real, true, factual, and accurate. There's also it's about class, not race detour, right? Where, if we just throw money at the problem, it is going to solve all of our racial disparities. And we know that that's not true, because the research is borne out that you could put all kinds of money towards this. In fact, if you've watched the Sean Reardon research on how school systems are moving along their students, when you control for socioeconomic status, but still disaggregate by race and ethnicity, you still have students of color that are underperforming or performing at lower rates than white students. And what does that tell you? For me, what it says is that there's nothing wrong with those students. We have to interrogate the tools that we are using to measure them, because those tools have those inherent biases due to the historical kind of legacy of how assessment tools have been used to gatekeep in many ways. So there are various ways that we have to combat this. And this is going to bring us up to how these culturally responsive teaching and leading standards come into play. You have to confront these issues directly. You cannot sit here and pretend like these are problems or these are not problems for our school system in terms of achieving the goal of young people and children living up to their greatest potential. We have to redistribute and reallocate resources so that we can make up for all the time that we've spent thinking we were doing good things by pretending to be this colorblind society, when in actuality, everything is rooted in systemic racism. And if we are not deliberate about prioritizing the work, we cannot be surprised with these particular outcomes. And so that's where the whole equity ideology principle comes into play, and how every single decision needs to be anchored in equity. And I'll get to that in just a minute. And we have to fix the injustice, not the kids. We got to stop putting the onus on children, and we have to put the onus on the system and how the system reinforces these things. So we're at this point. I talk about we need to be, sort of we have to have this reckoning with education, reimagine education and transform it. And here you see my friend breaking out of its mold, right? So it can become a different iteration of itself and live a different type of life. And that's where I really see the opportunity, because it's now been 2 years since we have been in this pandemic. And one of the first things I said immediately to the board 1 month after us being shut down, I said, here are my 3 recommendations, because we have to expect massive disruption in in-person learning for the next 18 months. If we accept that, it'll allow us to focus our attention in very deliberate ways in terms of how we are going to support children, educators, and families to be able to get through this. And the 3 areas that I recommended, I said, we need to continue to support schools to be these resource hubs of distribution of, food and social services. We need to get families connected, to the online learning, so on and so forth. We need to go deep with our educators in professional learning, because they are going to be encountering so many different things with trying to move from teaching in person to teaching online. None of them have been obviously trained to do that. And as we are witnessing everything that is unfolding with the gross disparities, and then just a few months later with what happened with George Floyd, we have to grapple with so many people processing everything on top of the pandemic with the racial uprising. And then the third area, we're going to have to go very deep on mental health and wellness, because this is going to take a huge toll on not just children, but educators and families. So when we think about these particular issues, these are grounding questions that I think we have to ask. Oftentimes diversity was like the buzzword DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, whatever the acronym is. The point is that we have to ask these questions. But what I particularly like about these questions is that they get at the how, right? Who's missing and what do we have to do? What responsibility do we have here? So diversity asks, who's in the room? Who's trying to get in the room and who can't? Whose presence is in the room that's constantly under attack or being made invisible? Inclusion forces us to make sure that voices are heard and their ideas will be taken seriously, whether or not they're the majority. And diversity asks, how many more people are we missing? Or how many did we have compared to last year? Whereas equity responds and says, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups have this perpetual majority, or how are we making sure that we are being inclusive? And that's where inclusivity comes in and says, how are we making everyone feel belong? And whose safety is being sacrificed or minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining these dehumanizing views? These are all grounding questions that are going to now lead into some of the work that had happened with the culturally and linguistically responsive, or the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, because all of this is a reframe. Right? Oftentimes when people think about systemic racism, they think it's the shark, when it's actually the water. It's in the water, it's in the air, it's pervasive, it permeates everything. All of us have been injected with this virus, and therefore we all have a responsibility to unlearn it. But we have to be deliberate. And so there are 3 data points that make the case for why we need these culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and leading standards. 52% of our student population are students of color. 82% of our teachers are white. So we have an opportunity gap right there. We are not preparing our educators for the diversity of the students that are right in front of them. We also know that when students have educators who reflect not just their identity, but their community's priorities and lived experience, it actually does make a difference in their academic outcomes. Schooling becomes relevant, schooling becomes relational, schooling becomes a space where you are seen, validated, and affirmed, instead of what we call in the education space subtractive schooling, where you have to subtract your identity, you have to subtract your language in order to be successful in a traditional school setting. And that's often what we ask of our students when they enter our current school system. The other piece with our culturally responsive teaching and leading standards has to do with our LGBTQ students. What we have seen in research is that when LGBTQ students have one adult that they have a meaningful relationship within a school setting, there is a 40% decrease in attempted suicides. So we are talking about life and death right here. This is the difference when we actually see young people in their whole full self, and we embrace it and we support that in the educational process. And then 13% of our students are dual language learners, which is a rich asset that we could totally leverage in our state. In fact, we created the state seal of biliteracy to acknowledge that skill, and for it to be transferable beyond a high school diploma so that employers can see a certain level of competency in the language, right? It's one thing to be bilingual. It's a whole nother thing to be biliterate, because that means that you can read it, you can write it, and you can speak it at a level of proficiency that is a professional level, or the academic language. It's one thing to have the social language when you're hanging out with your friends or you're with your family. It's a whole nother thing to give a whole professional presentation in a language other than your home language. So transformation is coming. I want to say it's not all doom and gloom. Those two bills, I'm not really worried about those bills because they're sitting in the rules committee. They are from a party that does not have the majority at this point. I hadn't even heard of them, and I watch all education bills. So I'm not really concerned about them because we have quite a few things underway here in the state of Illinois, but it doesn't mean that we got to put our feet up. One has to do with, you see the 5 bullet points here. I want everybody to understand our educational system is comprised of 5 areas, right? Standards, curriculum, assessments, educator preparation, and educator evaluation. The State Board of Education is actually responsible for 4 of those 5 areas. Curriculum is usually relegated to the local school district to make those decisions. But we have quite a few pieces underway that I think can help combat this kind of uprising in other states to try to take away this type of education from folks. We have a revision of social science standards that has a grouping of educational stakeholders, inclusive of educators and administrators and teacher educator programs, as well as parents and students, to really look and grapple with how we teach social science, and particularly how we're deliberate around, again, teaching factual and accurate and perspectives that are anchored in the lived experiences of those who have been historically marginalized. The curriculum piece, even though it's not at the state level, House Bill 2170, the Black Caucus had passed 4 pillars. One of them focused on education, and specifically that House Bill 2170 established freedom schools. So this is a model that comes out of, the civil rights movement that really, again, anchors education as an act of freedom and liberation, and making sure that these schools, which take place, during the summer, out of school time, to really anchor young people, and particularly young people of color, and understanding some of this history as well as present, and what we're going to look to in the future, Black futures. Assessments. What's super interesting here that's happening is there was a lot of pressure for the State Board of Education to seek a waiver from the Department of Education to pause on the federally mandated assessments. I've mentioned a little bit earlier, there's some problems with our assessments because of the limitations that they present, but also how I kind of feel like they bring about this culture, this punitive culture, and this culture of fear that I think compounds to what our previous presenter was talking about. Because as I was listening, I was just thinking, this is a lot of fear mongering. Essentially, the state board did not want to submit for a waiver. Even though I was on the board, of course, I was working with the folks on the ground to put that pressure, and we were able to at least get the board to finally agree to submit the waiver. Did the Department of Education grant it? No. But at least there were, what did come out of the woodwork is, out of our 852 school districts, 700 of them signed on to a letter saying that this had no place in our current system under a pandemic and under these conditions. All of the management organizations jumped on board. And I think what it did is, really bring attention and also build momentum for what we need to do, is have a deeper conversation about the role and value of assessments. And so there's now a discussion that the State Board of Education is undertaking to really say, okay, what is our assessment system serving us? How is it serving us best? How can we meet some needs of our dual language learners by having a native language assessment instead of your your English assessment, which really only evaluates your mastery of English and not necessarily your conceptual knowledge of the content you're learning in English. I also have a bill called Too Young to Test, where we are attempting to put some guardrails and making sure that we do not have standardized assessments imposed in the K through 2 grades, because child development is so fluid during that period. Standardized assessments, because they're point in time, because they're designed to a particular standard, they really, call into question their value and validity, applying them in the kindergarten through 2nd grade years. Education preparation, this is that culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, which in the next slide, I'm going to go into more detail. And now we have a review happening of our Performance Evaluation Reform Act, which was a revamping of how we evaluated educators to see if, when we did this 10 years ago, did we actually improve the evaluation system or not? And we're doing so there's some pieces in the works right now, I think, that provide us with an opportunity and of discussion tonight was, this whole piece around the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. So, essentially what it was a set of updating our rules in the school code for teacher preparation programs to now meet these particular standards, so that as educators are going into the classroom, they have experiences, they have reflection, and they have course design that focuses on these 8 areas of self-reflection, of how their lived experience is influencing their teaching, the power dynamics, understanding that our systems are in a society that create and reinforce inequities. So we're not going to pretend like that doesn't exist. The necessity to learn about a student's background and language and learning styles so that you can make education more relevant, and to value a student's feedback and leadership, and to support and create the opportunities for students to be advocates and develop these relationships with their families and community, as well as have curriculum that reflects it and ultimately ensures that the diversity of the student population is represented in the broader learning environment. There can be a lot of harm done if we do not support educators in cultivating these dispositions, as well as being able to effectively apply the knowledge in their classroom settings. And so I'll just give you 2 little stories. There was a situation, the student was me. And I can tell you this was before we had these learning standards. So on the left side, what you see here is an image of your classic, and I say that in quotes, American literature. As a freshman, I took a honors American lit class. And I remember looking at the syllabus, and I go to the teacher and I said, this is American lit. Why are there no people of color on this syllabus? This is very Eurocentric. And I mean, she was beside herself. She didn't know what to do. She was like, oh my God. And she said, I don't know. Do you have any ideas? And she actually worked with me to develop and to improve this particular syllabus, right? Fast forward a couple of years later, I'm in honors British lit over here on the right. And this educator took a very different approach. He decided from the outset, instead of us going deep into the canons of British literature, what were we going to do? We were going to read all of the works that came out of writers who come from countries who have been colonized by the British. And so I got a whole array of world perspectives. And then he had the student teacher come in and teach us Chaucer. We did that for a couple of weeks, and he was like, we're done, right? 2 different approaches. But what I can tell you is that what did these teachers do? They learned from my background and the other students in the classroom. They valued the feedback and allowed an opportunity for leadership and advocacy. And then we co-created a curriculum and ensured that the diversity of the students was reflected in the environment. That's what culturally responsive teaching and leading is. And we are at this point in time where, as I said, We need to reimagine education. We have gone through such a difficult 2 years, whether it is the health situation, whether it is the racial uprising. We cannot go back to what it was before. And what can you do? As people have said earlier in the beginning of this, lift your voice, raise your voice, use it to be a catalyst to have these conversations, to go deeper, show up and mobilize at school board meetings. Think about even running for your local school board, or in Chicago, we have local school councils, which are amazing site-based management teams where you can make some very localized decisions. And then also check on the people who are leading this charge, because that can be very laborious to be that constant bullhorn and that disruptor and rallying the troops, and figure out how you can help support and shoulder the burden. I always like to, either begin or end my presentations with a story that comes from the Maasai community in Eastern Africa, specifically Kenya, and the way that they just have perfected this, art of how they ask each other how they're doing, right? Instead of saying, "Hi, how are you?" The question is, "And how are the children?" And it doesn't matter whether you have children or not. The point is that children are our greatest assets in our community. And if the children are well, we know that their parents are well, their caregivers are well, the environment is safe, the environment is clean, and that ultimately children serve as a barometer for community well-being. And so you're always looking for the response, all the children are well. And that's what I'm charging us all to do, is how we can be bearers of ensuring that all of our children are well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate both of you. We've received several questions, which one is, why haven't people heard about the bills that James was mentioning? As the senator said, they are stuck in rules. Each of them, one has one sponsor, another one has two sponsors. They aren't going to go anywhere. That it's past the deadline for them to get out of a regular committee, much less rules. Another question for Mr. Tager. Are you aware of any major universities are setting requirements for entry that incoming students must be knowledgeable about U.S. history, specifically slavery, mistreatment of Native Americans, discrimination against women, and so on?
Well, I mean, a lot of universities will have core curriculum requirements, of which, history may be part, but, that's what comes to mind. The end. I think that's as far as I can take it, really.
Anne, do you have questions that were submitted?
This is maybe a question for the senator, that confronting all of these challenges requires teachers and administrators who are brave and smart and thoughtful. But at the same time, we seem to have a shortage of teachers, people leaving the profession. And so what is the path forward, and where are these leaders that we desperately need?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. Okay. So I just want to frame shortage. I think in order for us to address the problem, we have to accurately frame it. People like to use the word shortage. I like to call it vacancies. And I started to really use that term. Great article that talks about, just because you can't buy a Ferrari for 99 cents doesn't mean there's a shortage of Ferraris. Right? We have to look at the root causes and why people are leaving the profession. And we have seen, I think, the most acute presentation of that in the pandemic in terms of a lack of respect for the profession, the enormous pressure and the punitive state in which educators and administrators are undertaking this incredibly important work for our society. I mean, right now we have a bill that just came over to the Senate from the House to unionize principals, because it has become more and more apparent how they're in between a rock and a hard place. And so that's one kind of solution that's out there. And there's one bill that I actually have introduced as well, with trying to get young people into the field of education sooner versus later. And that is lowering the age of our paraprofessionals. Those are the folks who work in small groups with our students who have individualized education plans, or our dual language students, or our younger students, to provide additional supports to the lead teacher. And I mean, I think more so than ever, we're going to need more, supports in our classrooms. And so for elementary schools, we now have lowered it so that you can be 18 and apply if you meet the other requisites. You can apply to get in the classroom so that you can get that field experience, because a lot of times teachers come out of their, prep programs excited, ready to take the keys, and then they go to the classroom and they're, are you kidding me? I gotta do all this. So this is a way, I think, to kind of have almost an apprenticeship model. The other piece, I think, is the financial barriers, right? We need to clearly make way for that. Another bill that I passed last year specifically was to create an early childhood higher education consortium. We have 28,000 individuals who have less than a bachelor's degree teaching in early childhood or supporting teachers in early childhood. So that's a workforce that we can easily upskill and get into the field, because we know the early years make a significant difference with the later years in the outcomes there. And we were able to get $200 million to support them with scholarships and wraparound services, as well as making sure we have 2-year and 4-year institutions have these streamlined agreements so that they can make it easier to get through the various steps for licensure as well as bachelor's degrees. So there's a multitude, I think, of ideas out there, some of them in the idea form, some of them starting to be operationalized. A couple of years ago, we raised the minimum wage for educators that will go into effect next year, so that, they're not at this, basically making poverty wages as an educator. We got rid of the basic skills test, which was a huge barrier for pre-service teachers. So there's a variety of ways, but I think we have to stop calling it a shortage, and we need to call it for what it is. And it has historically been set up in a way to put just enormous amounts of pressure on teachers when they don't have the resources or the support to be effective.
And thank you so much to both of you. I'm afraid we've run out of time. James, would you like one final comment? I think you earned it. Yes.
I'm really gratified to hear that HB 5494, HB 5505 appear not to be going anywhere. That's wonderful news. A reminder that, this battle is also being fought in the local level, right? So it's a reminder to be involved in your school district conversations, your school board conversations, because a lot of the efforts to influence our children's education is being affected there. And again, part of the wave of national hysteria we've seen around anti-critical race theory, it's playing out in local communities, school board meetings, et cetera. So, if you are struck by what I've said today, a great way to be a counterweight to that hysteria is to be present and active in your local school board and your local school district.
You're absolutely right. Thank you to both of our speakers for sharing your passion and your insights with us today, and to our league members who participated in this as well. Please stick around to complete a brief poll. And tomorrow at noon, please join us for our next session titled, How Can People with Arrest or Criminal Records Ever Become Fully Free? Thank you again to all of you.
Thank you.